Okay, tonight I want to talk about the maintenance and sustaining of Simcha, joy, in the religious community. I want to start with a comment by Nietzsche, who said that the worst anti-joy, put it this way, the worst abomination in Western civilization was the making of a New Testament, connecting it to something called the Old Testament, and calling it one book, the Bible. That was Nietzsche's point. And Nietzsche's, all of his work was really to try to influence, make an impact on Western civilization that fit this very, very strong statement about Christianity and the state of affairs. Nietzsche was a secretary for Wagner, and for 2 years he lived in his house, and he thought that Wagner would be in music what he was in philosophy. And of course, after he saw what was going on with Wagner, and he was a real German nationalist, he broke with Wagner, and he wrote 4 books against Wagner and a number of pieces against Christianity. Now, if you look in the Chumash, we have a pasuk which says, we have the Ivrit and we have the translation, that there'll be repercussions from Bnei Israel who are not doing the mitzvot b'simcha u'v'tuv lev, with joy. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying you're going to have a lot of difficulty and problems, and in the last analysis, anxiety, depression, from this idea that somehow you're relating to the mitzvot in ways other than simcha. Now Nietzsche, to make his statement, read the Bible. Call it how he read it. He called it, I think his father was a preacher, but for sure he read the Bible. He didn't just pick it up at a hearsay to make such a bold and vociferous statement. So he read the Bible, and this pasuk, when he came to it in the end of Dvarim, for sure, absolutely, gave him a realization that when you look at the biblical world, the whole religion, in the big picture, in Western civilization, you see it's totally against this pasuk. So this pasuk could serve as a kind of a catch-all for Nietzsche. Now, b'derech agav, Nietzsche didn't experience the Shoah. Nietzsche he died in 1900. Matter of fact, he had brain damage from 1890 to 1900, and his sister, who was a real fervent nationalist, took over his writings and even changed them around. He wrote a book called The Will to Power and changed his writings around so that they would support German nationalism, Nazi party, and so forth. So we have to understand, first of all, it's an irony of history. Here's somebody who was so against and wrote against nationalistic Germany and nationalistic religion and all of that. And the irony of history turned out to be, for the popular mind, a great supporter of Nazism. Nietzsche was saying, well, he's the guy. He developed the concept of Übermensch, of the overman. And that fit in with genetic selection and Mein Kampf. If you read the material, you'll see the fit. And so you have this irony that somebody who was so anti-Christian, anti-nationalism, became a pillar of Nazism. Now, when Wagner also became the pillar, but Wagner was true to form. I mean, he didn't make a critique. He was part of that whole system. So Nietzsche, in a way, was concerned with the same problem that we're going to talk about tonight. How to keep Western civilization alive in such a way that we don't fall into this big trap of, call it hakohava, depression, anxiety, and so forth. Okay, so this is enough on this little point. The point is about Nietzsche. A last word. The translations of Nietzsche that came out in 1910, 1920 into English were also a carryover of this view. There was a guy, Walter Kaufmann, who in the 1940s, from Princeton, who retranslated everything in the Nietzschean corpus and brought him back into the picture that he was talking about. He coined the phrase, yea to life. That was a motif that ran through his writings. He called yea to life. And what he was fighting against was the deadening of this affirmation, the deadening of life in civilization per se. And he had a critique of democracy and so on, and a critique of Judaism. But he critiqued Judaism. He critiqued the money lending and everything else, and he went to the New Testament. And he critiqued Judaism in Europe. But in modern language, he missed what Judaism is all about, or what Jewishness is all about, to use the contemporary term. Okay, so this is just one of those things in history that sometimes it could take 50, 60, 100 years before we got back on track, such that somebody like me, as a Torah person, was influenced greatly by Nietzsche. I taught him 8 times courses on Nietzsche, and at that time, searching for where I stand in Judaism and so forth, he played a big role in helping me formulate what eventually became the breakthrough and a more mature understanding of Torah and mitzvot. So he played a very big role for me. In the, just b'derech hagav, in the earlier part of the 19th century, in 1820, 1830, Rousseau was the big man for me because he faced the same problem in terms of society, in terms of politics. His answer was, you cannot immerse yourself in society that's built too much on rights or too much on duties. Rights and duties will block individuality, will block the development. My favorite example was the kibbutz. So the kibbutz says, look, we're going to invite somebody to talk next week. They put a notice on the bulletin board and everybody is supposed to come. And some people say, look, that's just the night that I have a card game or I have this thing or I have a group and whatever it happens to be. And so the kibbutz went out and said, look, if you don't want, we won't invite speakers. But if we invite speakers, you have to come and give up other things as a priority. Now, when that's a one-shot deal, that's fine. That's understandable. And the person can make his decision. But when it becomes a pattern, then the very kibbutz is blocking the individual, the individuality of the person. Shouldn't there be a place there for people to say, look, I can't come for this. I have something else, which to me is more important. But when you have too much duty, obligation, it blocks individuality. And if you have too much freedom, you think you're getting individuality, but you're really getting a flattening of your whole society. Because everything becomes domain of pleasure, like you said before, money and so forth. And what you think is some enduring joy somehow doesn't come. It doesn't follow. Whether it's going on with women, sexual, money, whatever, it's always somehow a never-ending thing. You have one, you want more, and so forth, and that's the way it goes. Okay, so just the thing about Nietzsche was important to understand that he's been shortchanged in the history of philosophy, and he has now, with the material, come back into vogue with this view. Okay, so now this pasuk. What I want to try to do tonight is to open up some points, discussion about what this thing of Simcha and joy is in the religious orientation, and I have two suggestions for improvement, and then open it up for a discussion. Okay, so the first point is that the pasuk talks about Simcha Tulev Merov Kol, from the state of affairs that Moshe Rabbeinu is describing, which was well-to-do, which was affluence, which was having all the good things, just like today, because that's not to be belittled. The fact that Jews have money, the fact that Jews have power, the fact that Jews have the prestige, so this affects or plays a role in how they relate to the religion, to the mitzvah. They have the money to do other things. So it's not just a zero. So the pasuk is very much on target. But now there's a question. This pasuk appears among the curses. There's a list of 50, 60 curses at the end of Dvarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu is saying that if the Jews, if Bnei Israel won't observe, follow HaKadosh Baruch Hu with joy, do the mitzvahs from joy, with joy, and so forth, they will have anxiety, they will have tension, they will not have a yay to life approach, a yay to life set of feelings. So the question is, what is this doing inside the curses? There's no place in the Chumash where it says that we should do the mitzvot with Simcha. That's implied here, of course, but it's coming in from the negative. It's coming in from the negative. The closest we come, the word Simcha only appears one other time in the Chumash. Samachta v'chagecha appears more when it's understood. You're talking about a holiday and a commemoration. There we do talk about Simcha. But generally speaking, as a general statement about doing the mitzvah with Simcha, it's left to be put in a context of bad things or curses that will happen to Bnei Israel when they don't do the mitzvah. It's put from the point of view of the negative. So the answer to that question is that, and I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but the answer to that question is that in these curses, Moshe Rabbeinu was in effect talking about what Judaism of his time, what the society of his time, which is 1500 BC, will look like in the period when we have a temple 800 years later. When we have a temple, we have bureaucracy, we have organized society, and different institutions which we today are much more familiar with than civilization at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. We have to construct it. There's not much that material to construct antiquity bichlal, and in particular ancient Israel. So it wasn't exactly nomadic, but it wasn't organizational in the sense that everything had structures. It wasn't a government in the sense that Shlomo HaMelech, David HaMelech had government. We, as Bnei Yisrael, entered the big world with the building of the temple and the development of the whole society based around that. The forerunner to this, as you know, is Shmuel, this in a certain sense was a concession to the people who pestered and said, no, we want to be like every other nation and have a state and have organized structure and so forth. And no, if somebody would raise the question, well, you're going to lose something in the process. You're going to lose neighborship. You're going to lose relationships of people. You're going to lose the primacy of the family, which in the Chumash world is fundamental. The life energy that I call the life energy of the Avot plays a role after the person dies, it's not that everything dies. There's a connection between people that are deceased and the new generation that inherit the strengths and the life energy and the yay for life that was in the Avot. And many times in the Chumash, Moshe Rabbeinu he's entreating Hashem to do something on the behalf of Yisrael, and he'll bring in Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. In a number of places in Shemot and so forth, 6, 7 places, you have this refrain where he brings that in as part of the orientation. In Dvarim, which is Moshe Rabbeinu's farewell address, he does the same thing. Part of the rhetoric, I analyze the rhetoric. It's a speech, therefore it has rhetorical structures. It's a fantastic speech when you sit back and analyze the rhetoric, meaning, how did he try to persuade? Well, one of the ways he tried to persuade was by using phrases, possessives of Elokim. Elokeinu, Elokechem, Elokai, as ingredients. Instead of saying Hashem per se, in certain contexts he would say Hashem Elokeinu, including himself. When he was talking about going into Canaan, he wasn't going to go, so it wouldn't say Elokeinu, because he wasn't going in. The text is very exact, but one of the rhetoric dimensions of the text was his use of these, what I call possessives of Elohim. And some places, all of a sudden, he talks about Hashem straight. He says Hashem. And without these. And when you make an analysis of each one, you come up with a fantastic speech that blends and puts together these different rhetorical devices, just like the one I'm talking about now. Why all of a sudden he switched to Hashem? Why he should have kept it straight through the whole thing. Elokechem and so on, Elokeinu and so on. Okay, I mentioned in passing once about the Vilna Gaon who said that in the speech, and I found it to be true throughout the Chumash, that when it says Elokechem, it's talking about Kol Yachid v'Yachid Yisrael. Each individual, that's the plural. Elokechem is the plural. But the Vilna Gaon said that it's talking about each individual in Klal Yisrael. When it says Elokecha, which is about 100 times in the text, second person, it's a speech. So when it talks Elokecha, the singular, it's talking about Klal Yisrael Bichlal. So if, to give an example, it's talking about, the text is talking about, Moshe's in his speech is talking about the going to war, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu helping the nation of Israel, it'll say Hashem either straight, with full power, or with Elokecha. If it's on the aspect of that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will help individual soldiers who are going to have to fight as part of that war, it will say Elokechem. And there's 10, 15 times where it says Elokechem. When you make an analysis of the text, just in terms of those, you get eye-open, a beauty and poignancy of the exactitude of the rhetorical dimensions inside the text. Just b'derech agav, again, in the Chumash there's a general principle which we have lost sight of in the West, in Western language and Western grammar. When you have the name Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, and it's without modification, without Elokei, or without Elokecha, that name alone manifests full power, full substantiality, full impact. So sometimes in Moshe Rabbeinu, like I'm doing Shemot now, Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to Paro, and so you see sometimes he uses Hashem, Elokei, and so forth, and sometimes he uses Hashem, pow, because he wants to get the most power. And so grammatically, linguistically, shall we say, in the Torah system, biblical language, and it applies to everything in the language, to all nouns, but especially to the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem or Elokim, Hashem in particular, that manifests the fullest substantiality. Of course, what do? We are not built on the old biblical view of things. We're built on the Greek view of things, which says that we have a substance, a noun, a subject. Then we have predicates. The predicates are quality. The main predicate, they're 10 in Aristotle, but the main predicates are 4. They're substance, quality, quantity, relation. So what does that mean? When you say a noun, okay, let's stick to our example. You say Hashem, okay, who manifests himself in this particular place, and so on, so on, so on. You gain information. If he didn't say that he's localized in a particular place, we don't know. We just say Hashem. We gain information, but we lose oomph. We lose substantiality. So that allows you in the Chumash this switching to different places where you have one and different places where you have the other. But in the West, we have bypassed that and have a grammar that really puts primary the information. And particularly, what do we know if we don't know how much, right? The quality, what color, red, blue, pink, and so on. And relationships, which there's 4 or 5 types of different relationships. So unless we have added to the noun these predicates, these properties, these characteristics, we really are way up in the clouds of abstraction. That's what we would say. We would say, well, we're in the abstraction. We didn't give you information. We just say Hashem, or the boy, or David, or name, or whatever. But it's not giving anything about you. I don't know anything about you. I don't know. I just know the name. Mm-hmm. So we would say that's a privation. Well, in the Chumash kind of a text, that name carries full substantiality. There's just an aside about the language and the grammar, which has been eclipsed. And so when we read it with Western eyes, we miss all of this dimension in the text itself. But the text is based on something else. So of course, we're not putting ourselves in the shoes of that. I discovered that inside. I haven't found it formulated, but it's in the text and by example. I mean, if you take 100 examples and you see that it's operative, and you see every time there's a switch to one or the other, you're gaining information but losing substantiality, or vice versa. So if you do it 100 times, it's the burden of exposition, and there's somebody else who wants to talk. Okay, so one of the points is that the lack of Simcha comes in good part from the religious personality doing the mitzvot. That's what we're talking about, doing the mitzvot, committed to the mitzvot system, having a certain kind of a psychological bias to look at Aveirot, to look at where we fall short. If you stand back from the religion, from Judaism, and you look at the big picture, there's an emphasis on looking at ourselves, looking at the society, and so on, as to where we fall short, and what we have to do to reconstruct and overcome that. And so, we look at Yom Kippur, we look at the holiday, and we have to somehow, we look at ourselves as being amiss. So instead of counting blessings, and looking at, to use the metaphor, looking at the cup half full, we're looking at the cup half empty. And that's a pervasive characteristic of the religion which has come down to us and disturbs this yay to life orientation to the religion. That there's a bias on looking at the weak part of ourselves. And that affects your whole personality, because you project and you develop that into a whole dimension of how you look at yourself. And we look at ourselves as, relatively speaking, weak, needing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, without self-reliance, we would say, well, that's what Hashem wants. Like something happens that is bad for us, we say, well, that's what Hashem wants. Okay? Or Gamzu Latova, or things like that. In other words, there's a tendency to do that, but underneath it is a kind of a psychological bias of looking at things from the point of view of the negative. And one of the things that was built into this whole idea of not doing the mitzvot with Simcha is precisely that. In modern terms, Freddie was big on Rav Nachman. One of the big points, I spoke about it once, we had another different session, but one of the big points in Rav Nachman was exactly this, that you can't give respect. He's talking about lachav zchut, giving lachav zchut to somebody, not being judgmental, looking at the person in his position, instead of making a quick judgment. Stand back, don't judge so fast, because you may be missing information. And we do it all the time. We make a judgment on little things. You did this, you did that, but there was a reason for that I changed, but you didn't. I didn't tell you. I didn't have a chance to tell you. So of course, and between man and wife, and so little things like that. If it's one, it doesn't mean anything. If it's 100 a day, it means a lot. It sets up the pattern of the relation, the man-woman relation. So this whole motif that's built into this pasuk is a very up-to-date modern orientation. Chassidut, one of its goals was to try to fulfill this orientation. But in Rav Nachman, it's very clear that this is one of the big things, because for Rav Nachman, HaKadosh Baruch Hu hates depression. He hates self-negation. He hates the opposite of self-reliance. And that is what has to be worked on, of how do we restore a mental health orientation which has in it this dimension. Moshe Mordechai is shaking because that's his work.
I'm enjoying myself.
That's his work. I mean, that's what we're doing. But anyway, that's the story. So, one suggestion is, and I mentioned it a number of times in passing, there is in Torah a concept called Eis Lasos Lashem. That there's sometimes when, at the level of the religion per se, this is not for the Yachid, this is in general, that events could happen in such a way that one has to, that the people, Anshe Knesset Agdola, or the Bezdin, or whatever, they have to, or the teaching leadership, they have to somehow do things that may look anti-Torah, but really are in the service of Torah. Now, there's a principle, I'm not going to go into it, I don't even know enough about the halacha of that, what the details are, but there's a halacha that deals with that. But at the level of the individual, I said a number of times, Judaism must develop in the contemporary world a concept of conscience, individual conscience. In point of fact, that's what's operating in most of the Jews today, who don't believe in this, don't believe in that, and pick and choose. That's a law of conscience. You have this in the whole issue of women in the court system, and so on and so on. So, if something is so disturbing that it disturbs the rest of your whole approach to mitzvot, we shouldn't say, well, you have to eat it. You have to eat the daisa. Sorry, that's the law, that's it. We can't do anything about that. Well, maybe we can. At least what's in our power is to change our attitude, our orientation to the material. So at the level of the Yachid, as dangerous as it may seem, because if you don't catch your real feelings, you say, well, I don't like it. And you're not telling me that, you're not saying that. You're saying, I don't like it. But I'm really saying, I have a law of conscience. But on the assumption that the law of conscience will operate in the Yachid, There is place for a law of conscience which says, look, I personally won't do that. Whether you should publicize it is another issue. Whether it should be on the fringe, okay. But when it's publicized, it becomes a public thing and plays into a role that's not the best for the Torah system. Okay, so I said one thing that's required is somehow to get into our orientation and our talking about Torah and doing the Torah, learning and doing mitzvot, is, in addition to what I said before about seeing the cup half full, in addition is to be working with a law of conscience, a law of sensitivity. The example I gave was, that I mentioned a number of times, when my mother was sick in the hospital, so we spent all the time, staying there through the night and so on and so on. And I had a kippah, and the guy saw me with a kippah, and he said, oh, you're just a man. Well, you know the guy from Adam. His father's on the machine in Shari Tzedek, on the breathing machine. He said, look, he came in from California. He's here 3 weeks. He says, look, there's nothing that can be done. There's nothing, I can't get a night's sleep because I know that my father is on this machine. It's not doing anything. And he kept on talking in such a way, it was coming from the heart. It was feelings coming from the heart. Why don't they just pull the plug? Why don't they just, well, I should do it, he says. He'll say, he'll do it. When they're not looking at night, nobody's there at night. And the nurses are in the room, and he says, he'll pull the plug, and that's all. What are you doing? So from that experience, I said, look, this is Shari Tzedek, another hospital's different, but from that experience, for a number of weeks, because he never pulled the plug, and they never pulled the plug, and his father was still in that position. But from the talk, and from the experience, and being with the guy, every night for 2 weeks, in the corridor of the hospital, it dawned on me that there is a place. I'm not dealing with the issue per se, but there is a place for exercising a law of conscience because it's affecting your whole approach to the mitzvot system. So that's what I learned from that experience. I wasn't big enough to talk about the issue and so on and so on. But to have this thing operative does play a role in a person. It sounds dangerous because it could be insincere, but on the other hand, doing nothing for the individual that helps restore a joy, a happiness, a life orientation to the mitzvot is something that is calling out to be done. Okay, so this is one suggestion that I have. And another suggestion, the other one, this relates to the individual, to the yachid. But the yachid is a big difference, don't misunderstand. To publicize it, to make yourself as an example for others, to change the law, that is not logically implied from a law of conscience. A law of conscience means you're committed to the law. But the way it's set up right now, I'm a woman, I can't stand the way they treat women in this particular domain and so on and so on. We can't just sit by and do nothing. We have to do something. But at least in the beginning, the feeling shouldn't be stamped down as nothing. The person has a feeling that's part of the individuality of the person, and so that feeling must be respected. Our job as teachers of Torah is how can we somehow get this across in teaching and later in Sanhedrin and so forth. But that's one of the basic sets of problems. Okay, so as I said, that's for the yachid and not for the tzibur. And again, whether it should be made public, once it's public, it's not in the yachid quite, it's already in the middle ground, and so it has different effects. And you certainly don't want to take that as the paradigm case, as the optimum imitation. Your goal is not to imitate the person who has this thing operative. Yes, if you're in that position, fine. But if you're not in that position, the goal is people who do mitzvot and have maintained simcha and joy and have the difference. And what does that mean? A simple thing, in simple things. In simple things. You have a Friday night Suda. Well, to enjoy the people around the table is not exactly a chiyuv as part of the mitzvah. That's, if you want to call it hidur, you want to call it an extra, you want to call it a dimension. Well, for some people in a contemporary world, that is no less and even more important than doing the chiyuv. The chiyuv is embedded in a field of ideas and of actions and of sensitivities, okay, which play a role in the mitzvah. That plays a role in the formulation of the mitzvah. In the beginning, quite a few years ago, when I wrote the piece about the nature of mitzvah, so that mitzvah was a lot of short statements. Doing the mitzvah with a headache, doing the mitzvah after a fight in your house, doing a mitzvah from this, doing a mitzvah from that, doing a mitzvah with an emphasis on peer group, it's just listing in short quips, in short statements, like aphoristic, like Nietzsche wrote, in short statements. That's not to be thrown away. Doing the mitzvah with a headache is a different thing than doing the mitzvah without a headache. What's the headache got to do with the mitzvah? Like I mentioned about, in passing once, we talked about the Ari, about blowing shofar, that in the Ari, in the Kabbalah, we're dealing with things that are not part of the mitzvah. You don't have to get red in the face. Suppose your bodily constitution is you don't get red in the face. So why is the Ari saying, well, let's interpret Kabbalistically, in terms of the Yesod Sfirot, the redness of the face, because most blowers get red in the face. But what does it have to do with the mitzvah? That's already the context of the mitzvah. But the context of the mitzvah is part of the life, of the chai bohem of the mitzvah. So that these things have different aspects and put the mitzvah in a field. And my favorite example always is putting things in a field, where we're talking about the thing per se, and when we put it in a field, it starts to take on nuances that we didn't think about before. And that's a fundamental concept in my work of putting things in a field. As you know, you put an idea, a cognition, a thought. There's dealing with the thought per se, whether it's true or false. And there's dealing with the thought with respect to how does it function for meaning, for value. As you know, for many years, I was one of these guys in the first one. Everything was filtered through the mind with respect to truth or falsity. And it took me 40 years to understand, from students and relationships and people and even our own group, to understand that that's not the total picture. That's too much of an emphasis on cognition. It's not to de-emphasize, to throw it out, but it's to put it in bound. That there is a place for listening to one's heart. There is a place for listening to one's sensitivity in terms of this. So I say, after 40 years, my work shifted to start to articulate the relationship between the cognitive dimension, which is thought in the running for truth and falsity, and then cognition mixed with emotions, with sensitivities, which has to do with meaningfulness, and the action of the person, which is the two that go together. So that in Kabbalah, and then after doing that, I discovered there it is right in front of the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah system is built exactly on the same thing. Cognition, the cognitive 3 dimensions of Chokhmah Bina Das, 6 dimensions of feelings, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferes, Netzach, Yisod, and Malchut is the combination of both. And so in the Kabbalah systematics, which is describing the neshama, the world of the neshama, of the human being, you have this whole approach right there facing you with the orientation. Cognitive, affective, actional. In Chinuch, for example, there was a famous book It was called Taxonomy of Educational Objectives by a guy named Bloom. And for years, it was the classic work in curriculum building, in chinuch, namely, it gave you a picture and a set of tables and everything to understand the cognitive, he called it the cognitive domain. Educational objectives, I think something like that, and then he called it the cognitive domain. And for years, that operated. But it also took years to put out the next piece. The next piece was the affective domain. In other words, we were training teachers in pedagogy and curriculum. We were training teachers built primarily on the cognitive. And it took 20 years or 15, 20 years before the second, it could have been that it emerged that he didn't have in mind to write one like that 20 years before. But from the material and from working with teachers and students and so on, they realized, well, we got a whole little dimension here. So it came out with a book called Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, is the name of the book, by a guy named Bloom, and cognitive domain, affective domain. And so you hear a beautiful illustration with straight in the Kabbalah type orientation, that you're widening up the human being. And indeed, to finish the point, I discovered, and you know, that there's an actional dimension. There's a body dimension. It's not just cognition, affection, the affective domain. It includes the whole dimension of the biological and the physical and so forth. So that it's what I call chaya, neshama, guf, existence. The three components, to give a title, to make it a title, there's three components. Chaya is the living dimension, and neshama and guf, and they really reflect these dimensions of the person. Okay, so this is the story with respect to the Yachid. To finish off the point, I have one suggestion that deals with the Tzibur. There was a guy named Carver, I think that was his name, who wrote an article in Harvard Law Review on nomos and narrative. It was about a 60, 70 page article that ran for quite a number of things. When I looked in the library, you had to Xerox half your paycheck to Xerox it and put it together and read it. But this is a famous article in Harvard Law Review, where he dealt with nomos and narrative. Nomos is the law, and the narrative is what I call the ideational field within which the law functions. It's not just the law. It's the law in a wider ideational context where ideas play, like spirit of the law. Spirit of the law is not the law. Morality of the law. But without discussion, without having a backdrop, without having some information, without being able to discuss it in a rational way, in a feeling way, to have these dimensions, you're missing part of what law is. Law is not exclusively the legal product. It's not exclusively the legal product. It's the legal product embedded in a much wider, for no better term at the moment, a socio-psychological field, or a biopsychological field. And that's part of the law. And in his work, he quotes and says about the Talmud that indeed the Talmud, you see, it's the Talmud, not the Shulchan Aruch. The Talmud, it's an ideational field. In the halacha, the Mishnah is being discussed, the halacha, the Gemara is discussing and analyzing within a whole ideational field composed of Tanaim, Amoraim, and so forth. So that right there was this thing, and he mentioned it with lauding it as a great contribution or illustration of what he's talking about.
We have Halakha and Agadah.
Yeah,
Also,
right, exactly. You got halakha and agadah right in the same piece. So you see the switches in terms of the thing. So the law is not exclusively the product. And for me, being brought up in terms of the brisk, strict halachic tradition, I began to realize that I may fall short. It's a kind of intellectual elite to say and deal with the halakha in systematic terms, in strict logic, without putting in the cognitive, emotional, actional field, which is the chai bohem, which is the experience of knowing the mitzvah. I used to say, well, in brisk, when Reb Chaim Halevi would get a question from somebody in the community, so he would, today's Wednesday? Okay, he's going to look at it, he'll examine in his mind all the halachot, go over the sugya, the shakla b'tarya, and then when it come Friday morning, he would say to his posek, Simcha Zelik was his posek, he would say, lady, take the chicken to Simcha Zelik, and then in 5 minutes he'd say, it's kosher or treif. So I used to say, well, I'd rather be Reb Chaim Halevi. I was analyzing the whole thing, but the chai bohem, what about the woman with the chicken? What about the thing? So he took it as an occasion for analyzing the whole sugya and so on and so on. Great, fantastic. But how far it's away from the chai bohem of the mitzvah when the woman has to know tomorrow it's a kosher or not kosher. We don't have all the time in the world like halacha. For halacha, we have a long time scale. We can have a shakla b'tarya. Indeed, the Gemara had Tanayim and then a shakla b'tarya Amarayim, and so you have a 300-400 years spread of intellection on the material. Well, the study of the halacha has a larger range, but living has time scales.
Chickens don't live that long.
Right. So it's right there. Okay, so I introduced the suggestion that I'm going to make with this preface, that for me, aside from all the things that I learned about more balance and more taking capture of the different dimensions of the personality and so forth, and of the religious personality, I began to realize that one should not give up Chazal. I discovered that Chazal is the biggest, the Talmud, which is the legal system, the nomos and the narrative of the Talmud system, is to me one of the most significant contributions to Western civilization. That even the Roman law, which comes next, perhaps, and some of the English law may come next, the Roman law, the jurists, they studied with Chazal. That many of the concepts in Roman law were organized and came from Chazal. We were already an established legal system with fantastic material of Chidushim and, like David said, Agadah and the nomos and narrative of the Talmud. And so that whole thing was already highly developed. And so the Roman law, which Constantine and so on has a big, it's okay, it has things to play, but it's at least one example. For me, okay, with a bias you could say, for me, when you compare Roman law and English law and even American law with the Talmud, you see that there's, at least it holds its own without making any apologetic. That is a great contribution, is my opinion. But at least it holds its own. So I preface my suggestion with this because one of the greatest things in Judaism is the halachic system. What the Chazal did with inheriting the biblical world, the world of Shlomo HaMelech, the world of the prophets, and how Chazal put these things together in such a way to try to relate to Simcha in doing the mitzvah, to Chai Bohem, is unbelievable, fantastic thing. And the more you study the Chazal, they jump out at you when you have this flashlight. If you have the flashlight, all of a sudden you get some insight into a piece of Agadah that you didn't have before, because you you took it for granted that it was concerned with the product or a bypass. Like in many shiurim, the Rebbe will, in the yeshiva, in many high-level shiurim, the Rebbe would bypass the Agadah. You learn Kedushin, a fundamental Gemara, and in the Dafin, the Lamed Gimel, there's a lot of Agadah. Well, in many cases, in many yeshivot, high-level yeshivot, where they're oriented toward learning the halacha, they bypass. They don't read the Agadah. Why? Because it's not dealing with the substance of the shaklavataria, of the concepts involved in the strict understanding of the halacha of the din. So whereas one time I looked at that as a lack, I say, well, there's a place for that. There's a place. Why are we eliminating the narrative and just sticking to the normals? And so this is an important thing. Okay, so I gave this an introduction that for me personally, as I got older and more mature in Judaism and writing and the things, working in the Chumash world, whatever, I began to realize that one has to, at least for me, to relook at Chazal, the world of the Talmud, and even from a modern point of view, not from the point of view of a narrow conception of the law. So why do I say this? Because my suggestion is a radical suggestion. And you've heard it before in a different context, but I want to repeat it now in a simple way. According to the halakha, for many people, not all halachas, but for many halachas, since 1948, of the Jews coming back to Eretz Yisrael, in strict halachic legal terms, the nature of the time that we live in changed. There's a halachic category called the beginning of the Geula, the beginning of the redemption. It's not a theological point. It has theological dimension, but it's halachic. There's a halacha of Atchalta de Geula, beginning of the Geula. And indeed, I want to read for you a Mishnah in Sota, which is a Mishnah, part of the strict halacha. So you'll see, there's a Mishnah with Ikvata de Mashiach, the footprint of the Messiah. Chutzpah will increase, presumption shall increase, costs will be very high. The vine shall yield its fruit, but the wine shall be costly. Think of where we are today. Very expensive. And the empire shall fall into heresy, and there shall be none to utter reproof. Galilee shall be laid waste, and an area, Kablan, whatever, shall be made desolate, and the people of the frontier shall go about from city to city, with none to show pity on them. The wisdom of the scribes shall become insipid, scorned, and they that shun sin shall be deemed contemptible, and truth shall nowhere be found. Children shall shame the elders, and the elders shall rise up before the children. For the son dishonors the father, the daughter rises up against the mother, this is the pasuk, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house, the pasuk from Micha. The face of this generation is as the face of a dog, and the son will not be put to shame by his father. On whom can we rely? Only on our Father in heaven, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now this is a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah. And so what's being done here is describing the characteristics, the societal and personal characteristics of the beginning of the Geula. Not the end, not the final redemption, but where we are today. If you paskin, if you hold that from 1948 of the Jews impartial returning to Eretz Yisrael, there was a halachic change in the time that we live in. The time is now called Atchalta de Geula and not Galut. Until that time, we lived halachically in a time, remember, halacha covers everything. It gives halachic properties to space, time, places, people, and so on. Halacha, as a subject matter, includes time, the tkufa, the era that we live in. So the era we live in is described by this Mishnah and elaborated in Chazal when you look at the material, and there's a Gada and so on to build up the whole narrative picture. But we have a halacha. So I came up with this crazy, if there ever was a godsend, it's the following. Namely, for those who are concerned with keeping and enriching the halakha system, which is the minority, but if one will show its richness, it will slowly grow and become more than the minority. But for those who are concerned with the halachic system per se, and the living according to the halakha, wow, we got a godsend. We could ask questions, halachic questions. What are the implications of living after 1948, our time, in the Atchalta de Geula? What are the halachic implications, not ideological, halachic implications of the tkufa, of the time, which has a halachic status on it called Atchalta de Geula? And so I suggested and wrote a big piece on that, namely, what a godsend. In addition to Steinsaltz making the Gemara compatible with contemporary archaeology and ideas, and wrote a Perush, there's something else that's called for. Namely, a restudy of every inyan, of every topic in the halakha, from the point of view of the question, does the halakha of X, Y, and Z remain the same, or is changed because the time we live in has a different halachic status? So we got a godsend. We're talking about Sanhedrin. We're talking about from the point of view of action. Well, I propose something much wider. An organization that's concerned with Jewish law that doesn't start with the in-group, that includes Kol Yisrael, all of Yisrael. Anybody who is concerned, anybody who calls himself Jewish, has a Jewish identity, there's a place, and we have the computer tools to organize worldwide things. We need an organization which has as its narrative opinions and ideas that are coming from the full spectrum of Jews, related to the question, what are the halachic implications of Atchalta de Geula? And the answer has to be halachic, and there should be a line in the Gemara. Just like on the side there were a line, there has to be another Gemara, the same format, with another entry which says, Hilchot Shabbat, no change. They discovered that when you analyze, this is analysis, you got to analyze the text. And when you analyze the text, you see, well, Hilchot Shabbat, I'm giving you an example, no change. Geirut, conversion, oh, that's a big thing. A guy comes to a Rav or a Bezdin and wants to convert to Judaism. And he's honest and says, look, I don't believe in God, but I love these mitzvot and I do the mitzvot as best I can. Is it the same din before the Atchalta de Geula or after? When we take the Mishnah of Sota and we develop it out, so that's a characteristic of the time that we're living in. Should that person get Gerut or not? In the past, the guy comes in, he says, look, I don't believe in God. So they say, oh, I'm sorry, you have to believe in God. It's part of the mitzvah. Maybe it's part of the mitzvah for the time before Atchalta de Geula, but not for the time of after Atchalta de Geula. All I'm saying is, we need inquiry. Instead of taking for granted that we know the answer, we have to now have the opportunity and the infrastructure, worldwide infrastructure, to begin to put together a shaklavataria on the specific question of halacha, the halachic relation. I'm not talking philosophy. I'm not talking ideology. I'm not talking interest in changing the law to make it modern, up to date. How many people want to give up the law? Say we change it so much that it loses all the conceptual and ideational and feeling power that anybody who studies it experiences and understands. So that's why I prefaced my remarks with Carver on the legal system. You know, it's for me, I found that instead of falling into the idea of changing the law, even by Sanhedrin, even by authorized system, a Sanhedrin that changes the law to make it modern without doing what I suggested will again give us in the next kufa, in the next little generation, the same set of problems that we face today. It will be too narrow. It didn't capture the opinions and the ideas and the sensitivity of what in modern language is called Jewishness. There's Jewishness and Judaism. And what's come to the fore is the primacy of Jewishness and how we can use Jewishness, which means feelings, sensitivities, all this kind of thing, how we use that to infuse Judaism with a restoration of Simcha. And so my suggestion was, it's a godsend. It's unbelievable. You know, it's coming right on a platter. We don't have to go and try to change things from the outside, because in that sense we're giving up the whole greatness of the halachic system and the nomos and narrative of the system. But on the other hand, we're having a way, a practical way, of changing the system from inside the system. Because we're dealing with halakha, we're dealing, what are the halachic implications? Okay, that's two suggestions, one on the personal, one on the seaboard level, of how to restore the joyousness to the religious personality. You yourselves can fill in much from your own life experience and religious experience. You could fill in a lot of the pratim and detail of what it means when we talk about simcha and joy and so forth. I just try to highlight a few things in this talk, to highlight a few things to set it up for discussion. Okay, tonight I want to talk about the maintenance and sustaining of simcha, joy, in the religious community. I want to start with a comment by Nietzsche, who said that the worst anti-joy, put it this way, the worst abomination in Western civilization was the making of a New Testament, connecting it to something called the Old Testament, and calling it one book, the Bible. That was Nietzsche's point. And Nietzsche's, all of his work was really to try to influence, make an impact on Western civilization that fit this very, very strong statement about Christianity and the state of affairs. Nietzsche was a secretary for Wagner. And for 2 years he lived in his house, and he thought that Wagner would be in music what he was in philosophy. And of course, after he saw what was going on with Wagner, and he was a real German nationalist, he broke with Wagner, and he wrote 4 books against Wagner, and a number of pieces against Christianity. Now, if you look in the Chumash, we have a pasuk which says, we have the Ivrit and we have the translation, that there'll be repercussions from Bnei Israel who are not doing the mitzvot Simcha u'v'tuv lev, with joy. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying you're going to have a lot of difficulty and problems. And in the last analysis, anxiety, depression, from this idea that somehow you're relating to this B'derech Agav. In the earlier part of the 19th century, in 1820, 1830, Rousseau was the big man for me because he faced the same problem in terms of society, in terms of politics. His answer was, you cannot immerse yourself in society that's built too much on rights or too much on duties. Rights and duties will block individuality, will block the development. My favorite example was the kibbutz. So the kibbutz says, look, we're going to invite somebody to talk next week. They put a notice on the bulletin board and everybody is supposed to come. And some people say, look, that's just the night that I have a card game or I have this thing or whatever, a group and whatever it happens to be. And so the kibbutz went out and said, look, if you don't want, we won't invite speakers. But if we invite speakers, you have to come and give up other things as a priority. Now, when that's a one-shot deal, that's fine. That's understandable. And the person can make his decision. But when it becomes a pattern, then the very kibbutz is blocking the individual, the individuality of the person. Shouldn't there be a place there for people to say, look, I can't come for this. I have something else, which to me is more important. But when you have too much duty, obligation, it blocks individuality. And if you have too much freedom, you think you're getting individuality, but you're really getting a flattening of your whole society. Because everything becomes domain of pleasure, like you said before, money and so forth. And what you think is some enduring joy somehow doesn't come. It doesn't follow. Whether it's going on with women, sexual, money, whatever, it's always somehow a never-ending thing. You have one, you want more, and so forth. And that's the way it goes. Okay. So just the thing about nature was important to understand that he's been shortchanged in the history of philosophy, and he has now, with the material, come back into vogue with this view. Okay, so now this pasuk. What I want to try to do tonight is to open up some points, discussion about what this thing of simcha and joy is in the religious orientation, and I have two suggestions for improvement, and then open it up for a discussion. Okay, so the first point is that the pasuk talks about Simcha Tulev Merov Kol, from the state of affairs that Moshe Rabbeinu is describing, which was well-to-do, which was affluence, which was having all the good things, just like today, because that's not to be belittled. The fact that Jews have money, the fact that Jews have power, the fact that Jews have the prestige, so this affects or plays a role in how they relate to the religion, to the mitzvah. They have the money to do other things. So it's not just a zero. So the pasuk is very much on target. But now there's a question. This pasuk appears among the curses. There's a list of 50, 60 curses at the end of Dvarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu is saying that if the Jews, if Bnei Israel won't observe, follow HaKadosh Baruch Hu with joy, do the mitzvahs from joy, with joy, and so forth, they will have anxiety, they will have tension, they will not have a yay to life approach, a yay to life set of feelings. So the question is, what is this doing inside the curses. There's no place in the Chumash where it says that we should do the mitzvot with Simcha. That's implied here, of course, but it's coming in from the negative. It's coming in from the negative. The closest we come, the word Simcha only appears one other time in the Chumash. Samachta v'chagecha appears more when it's understood. You're talking about a holiday. Do the mitzvot in ways other than Simcha. Now Nietzsche, to make his statement, read the Bible. Call it how he read it. He called it, I think his father was a preacher, but for sure he read the Bible. He didn't just pick it up at a hearsay to make such a bold and vociferous statement. So he read the Bible, and this pasuk, when he came to it in the end of Dvarim, for sure, absolutely, gave him a realization that when you look at the biblical world, the whole religion, in the big picture, in Western civilization, you see it's totally against this pasuk. So this pasuk could serve as a kind of a catch-all for Nietzsche. Now, b'derech agav, Nietzsche didn't experience the Shoah. Nietzsche he died in 1900. As a matter of fact, he had brain damage from 1890 to 1900, and his sister, who was a real Brent nationalist, took over his writings and even changed them around. He wrote a book called The Will to Power and changed his writings around so that they would support German nationalism, Nazi party, and so forth. So we have to understand, first of all, it's an irony of history. Here's somebody who was so against and wrote against nationalistic Germany, and nationalistic religion, and all of that. And the irony of history turned out to be, for the popular mind, a great supporter of Nazism. Nietzsche was saying, well, he's the guy. He developed the concept of Übermensch, of the overman. And that fit in with genetic selection and Mein Kampf. If you read the material, you'll see the fit. And so you have this irony that somebody who was so anti-Christian, anti-nationalism, became a pillar of Nazism. Now, when Wagner also became the pillar, but Wagner was true to form. I mean, he didn't make a critique. He was part of that whole system. So Nietzsche, in a way, was concerned with the same problem that we're going to talk about tonight. How to keep Western civilization alive in such a way that we don't fall into this big trap of, call it hakol havel, depression, anxiety, and so forth. Okay, so this is enough on this little point. The point is about Nietzsche. A last word. The translations of Nietzsche that came out in 1910, 1920 into English were also a carryover of this view. There was a guy, Walter Kaufmann, who in the 1940s from Princeton, who retranslated everything in the Nietzschean corpus and brought him back into the picture that he was talking about. He coined the phrase, yea to life. That was a motif that ran through his writings. He called yea to life. And what he was fighting against was the deadening of this affirmation, the deadening of life in civilization per se. And he had a critique of democracy and so on, and a critique of Judaism. But he critiqued Judaism. He critiqued the money lending and everything else, and he went to the New Testament. He critiqued Judaism in Europe. But in modern language, he missed what Judaism is all about, or what Jewishness is all about, to use the contemporary term. Okay, so this is just one of those things in history that sometimes it could take 50, 60, 100 years before we got back on track. such that somebody like me, as a Torah person, was influenced greatly by Nietzsche. I taught him 8 times courses on Nietzsche, and at that time, searching for where I stand in Judaism and so forth, he played a big role in helping me formulate what eventually became the breakthrough and a more mature understanding of Torah and mitzvot. So he played a very big role for me in the